Welcome to the world of Mark's Money Mind, coming to you this week from Crested Butte, Colorado. I'm your host, Mark Troutman. This educational, personal finance show combines money lessons, timely topics, personal stories, and community wisdom to help listeners and viewers master their finances to enjoy a stress-free life of financial freedom. For this week's show, I thought I would publish a conversation I had along with my good friend Kevin Sebesta as we were guests on the Forget About Money podcast hosted by David Baughier. The topic of the show was the fun bucket. We certainly talked a lot about that in great detail, but the conversation really revolved around the mindset shift that needs to evolve when moving from years of accumulation to the actual implementation of spending your assets later in life. This is something that is harder than you might think for many of us who have lived for years with a frugal mindset. Take a listen to this chat we recorded just over a month ago. Enjoy.
What is a fun bucket, and how can it help us shift from a frugal mindset to a guilt-free spending mindset in retirement? Here we go. Welcome to the Forget About Money podcast, where we encourage you to take action today so that you can focus on what matters most to you. In this episode, we're joined by Kevin Sebesta, a former professional who retired early at age 43 and now shares his insights on financial independence and intentional living through his blog, Life in Fire. Alongside him is Mark Troutman, a seasoned voice in the FIRE community who, after 25 years in investment management, shares his thoughts on his Mark's Money Mind blog and podcast. Gentlemen, welcome.
Great to be here.
Hey, thanks.
Today, they'll discuss the concept of the fun bucket, a strategy for enjoying life in retirement without compromising the financial security. So let's start first with you, Mark. How did you first hear about the fun bucket concept, and what made you decide to incorporate it into your retirement strategy?
Well, so the first person that mentioned it to me was Kevin, who was on this podcast. And we were attending a campfire in California in 2021. And I actually stayed at his house beforehand. And of course, we talked way into the way late hours, early morning hours. And he was asking me how I was drawing down on my portfolio. And I explained that while I did have a drawdown plan, I was spending less than 2% of the portfolio a year. And he's like, you need to loosen the strings. You need to spend more. And I was like, yeah, but I feel like I'm doing everything I want. He's like, you need a fun bucket. And I said, well, what is a fun bucket? And then he described what it is. And I'm sure he will go into more detail about what it is, but that's how it started. And from that day forward, I've had this fun bucket, and it's just made me able to spend more comfortably. Well above the 2%, kind of where I was. I can throw it over to Kevin and he can explain a little bit more about what it is exactly.
Yeah, Kevin, can you define what a fun bucket is and why should retirees even consider creating a fun bucket in the first place?
I think, Mark and I were having a discussion, and our stories where we've been retired a few years and our accounts had gone up with the great returns of the market. And we realized we probably should be using some of that money. And so we talked about it being icing on the cake and pulling some off. And I should share that we're going to say this is not the 4% starting withdrawal rate, increasing for inflation discussion that most retirees hear about or FI people live by. This is a different strategy. So a lot of it came from the Retirement and IRA show podcast with Jim and Chris, where they talk about having lifetime secure income for your base great life, your minimum dignity floor, which is really just what it costs to live if you had no money in your savings accounts anymore, making sure your food, utilities, transportation, housing, and healthcare were covered for a long life, let's say into your mid-90s. And then there's some set asides for aging assistance, inheritance, special needs children, a buffer category. And then once all those requirements are funded with your assets, there should be money left over if you have this buffer. And that's what they call the fund number. And Mark and I turned that into the fun bucket, which is something we could actually use. And that's how we both had heard about this, but neither of us actually tried to use it.
Mark, you were spending 2%, I guess, in retirement, and then therefore you clearly had a buffer there. Is that right?
Right. So I retired at the end of 2015, and this discussion was in the summer of 2021. And as you know, the biggest concern is sequence of return risk, right? Mm-hmm. And I was spending, sub 2% for that first 5 years. And at the same time, the market was doing quite well during that period. So there was a lot of kind of excess that had built up as a result of spending way below the 4% rule, for example, and also the wind in my back. And that's where Kevin said, you just need to take some of that kind of cream off the top, the icing and the sprinkles, and move it over into this other account and just start being more comfortable spending on things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. And so it was kind of like you're way ahead of the game because of two reasons: spending way under what you could, even in a bad sequence, and you've had a good sequence. So because you're frugal and you have no need to do it, you need to segment it in a separate area and allow yourself to spend.
Yeah, I think that's something many people in the FI community struggle with, because you spend all this time just saving, and running math problems and simulations and Monte Carlos and 2% versus 5% versus 4% versus 3.21654%. And now that both of you are on the other side, looking back, what do you think of that mindset? And is it, for lack of a better word, is it silly to think like that, knowing what you know now?
I think a lot of people in the FI community get to the successful position they're in by having structure and by saving and spending intentionally. And I don't think that goes away after 10, 20, 30 years if you're getting older. And that's hard to break that habit of the safety. And I think the fun bucket thing, I don't think we mentioned it, but it's really a goal, a target, a requirement to spend this money. It's not just set aside for use. It's like, use this or someone else is going to use it at your end of plan. And that's the big push, is the requirement. I think also the 4% rule is the safest withdrawal rate for a 30-year retirement based off historical purposes on a 50-50 portfolio, meaning you're probably going to limit spending in your early years while your portfolio is growing, if it's not the worst case. And then you're going to die with money. And you could have used some of that or carved part of that off earlier for free spending, which is totally outside your personality if you're in the FI community.
Yeah, I would say it is a difficult mindset shift, going from being an accumulator, being frugal, thinking about how you spend during all of those years of accumulation, and then flipping a switch and saying, now you can spend your money. I find that is the hardest thing. It was hard for me. And I have found the people I've spoken to who have retired, onto their portfolio, it's a very difficult mind shift. And we have to kind of retrain ourselves. So for me, the fun bucket was a retraining mechanism to allow me to spend this money that I've accumulated over all of these decades. And I think also because I wasn't doing it at the outset, that snowball just continued to grow and grow and grow. And now it's kind of like I'm chasing the snowball down the hill. And it's kind of running away from me. It's a good problem to have. But now if you don't do this kind of earlier in your drawdown phase, you're going to find that it just becomes so large that it's, almost a challenge to spend the money. Like I said, I know that's a great problem to have, but for many in the community, I think that is what they are going to experience. And Michael Kitces did a article about the 4% rule. And of course, we're all looking at the worst case scenario. But the problem is, or not the problem, but the reality is a majority of the people could have spent a significantly higher percentage because they're not going to face that bad sequence. Only a small percentage will end up in that bad sequence scenario. And for many of us that don't experience that at the outset, we're going to be chasing that snowball down the hill probably for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. You mentioned that, that it is a transition from basically no spend or, investing and then spending on what you need to survive to giving yourself permission to spend. And Kevin, you said that it's not a can spend, it's a required spend. You retired at 43, and so you had to have gone through that transition from no spend to can spend to required spend. Can you talk about how you dealt with that?
Yeah, and that we didn't share this, but I've been fired over 10 years, just hit the 10-year mark. Mark is at 9 years, I believe, right around there. So we've been away, we call it retirement, away from our careers. We're not working for money. I do teach Osher lifelong learning courses, and little things come in because people find successful people, not because we go out looking for funds. I call that my play check, which is separate from my fund bucket. But I feel like you just have to get into this mindset. My wife and I took it cautious from 43 to 50. We still traveled around the world and we did things, but we spent within our structure that we'd planned. And at 50 was 2020. So we implemented a Roaring 20s plan where we could spend more money every month freely for the decade. And that's the money we were setting aside in our mind for this extra lifestyle. Then COVID hit 2 months later, in month 3 of that. So we had 2 successful months and then almost 2 years of slowed down spending. And in those 2 years, by 2022, the market returns had grown. And so we had 8 years left in the Roaring 20s. So we upped our amount based off of the new icing that was on our portfolios. And we've really had to push to spend on things and experience. And BJ, I met him at Economy. He talks about he loves things. He does do activities, but it all depends on what your interest is. And so there was one example I had is we spend on cars and guitars, it seems, at this house. Mm-hmm. And that's our interests. My wife says the cars, but they're not hugely expensive, but they're assets. And so we would have never done that while we were saving. We would have been very cautious in our first 7 years where the sequence of return risk is high. And now it's just like, we call it the F it bucket, and we just say, go for it.
Yeah, Mark, you've allocated, at least based on what I could find, you've allocated 25% of your annual spending to your fund bucket for a 4-year period. How did you determine that amount, and how do you plan to manage and replenish your fund bucket over time?
So that went back to the original conversation I had with Kevin. We were trying to decide. I said, so how much do you put in this fund bucket? And he's like, well, what would be an amount that would exceed what you normally would spend on, things out of the norm? And I was like, I don't know. If I got a 25% bonus on what I normally spend, that would be a big number. And I think we decided, and this was probably like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, so it's a little vague as exactly how it came about. But I spend, let's just say ballpark, $100,000 a year, $80,000 a year on average, something like that. So I just said, well, let's just throw $25,000 in there times 4, 100,000. There was more than that in excess between the, only spending 2% and the good sequence. And it wouldn't move the needle. He's like, how much could you put in there without affecting your plan going forward? And I was like, I could do that number and it would work. So that's what I did. It was just kind of a round number. It was effectively a 25% bonus over what I kind of normally spend. And that's how it came about.
Did that come from like a checking account that you already had just that much money in? Did you take it from a brokerage and just?
Yeah, it was in a taxable brokerage account. And I had recently sold a second home. So I had some ample liquidity to do this with. And it was just like, instead of throwing that back on the pile, as Carl and Mindy like to talk about, why not take some of that and throw it in this other account and literally label it fund bucket? It was in a separate account at an online savings account, and it's there for that purpose. And that gave me permission to spend it.
Kevin, do you recall this 3:00 in the morning conversation with Mark?
Absolutely, because it changed my focus on how we should be spending more and actually coming up with a number amount to do that. We were spending a base of around $5,000 a month. And ironically, $2,000 of that's health insurance. 500 or so is car, home, umbrella, all these other insurances. So half of our budget was insurance. And we added 20%, $1,000 a month, which was a huge amount of money to spend or try to spend on whatever. And sometimes when you explain or discuss something with someone else, it makes more sense to you for an action. And I think that's what helped with Mark and I discussion. And the funny thing is, we push each other frequently to use that fund bucket. When we went on the FinTalks cruise with Amberly Grant and her crew, there were 60 of us. We pretty much bought the most expensive cabin that was available. And it wasn't that much because it was 4 days. But we had people come hang out, visit us in our big suite. It was just funny because that was just a little piece of the fun bucket to show that we could do that. And we didn't regret it, but we have great memories from that. The whole memory, using your assets to invest in something that provides memory dividends from the Die with Zero book, Bill Perkins, is a very true strategy that you can keep these memories as long as you have your memory. And it's probably better than having a couple $1,000s more in the bank.
Yeah, I agree. And that's, you and I have visited a number of times, and that memory dividend, is that the right phrase?
Yeah, invest your assets in experience and things that provide memory dividends is how I view it.
Now we just got to figure out if every time that you and I visited, if those are positive memory dividends or
let's talk about you. You mentioned that you're retired in the past, and you were setting aside extra funds each month into an investment account. And how much of those set aside extra savings, what did I tell you to do with half of those?
Added to my FIT bucket.
Yeah.
Which I have not done.
And I also said to do that now when you're youngest and healthiest, you're going to be in the future. And I believe in that. And I can tell you, because I'm old, I just turned 54 now, and I have 10 years of this, and it's not the same as when I was 43 or 44.
I will say that your perspective on that, I do think about it often. And at some point, I do hope that I can make that transition. I just haven't yet. So I know I believe in you, and I believe in the message that you're sending. That's why we're talking about it right now. I think it's very important for people to hear. And maybe one day I will pull that trigger, and then you and I will be going and getting a big cabin on a cruise somewhere.
And the one thing I found is that having the money in that fund bucket has allowed me to spend on things that I wouldn't ordinarily do. But many of those things actually fit in my regular spending. But because it was over there in this account, so I could do, let's say, a first class upgrade, for example, on a flight, which might be $300 that I wouldn't have normally done. And the reality is it was fitting in my regular budget, but I wouldn't do it because it was excessive. But when you have this separate account that allows you to reimburse yourself for that expense, you'll find you will do a lot more things than you would have normally done. And I don't even find myself reimbursing myself from that fund bucket. And we can talk about the mechanics of how it all works, but it is fit within my normal spending anyway.
And I have a point on that too, because we're still getting good market returns on the money that we set aside for decades. And there's been more and more discussions in the FI community about people who are saying their investments are earning more return than they do at work or did at work. And yesterday, I bought a little guitar amp on Craigslist, and it took me like 3 months to decide, should I really buy this used amp? And then I checked my balances because I saw the markets have been going up for the past week. And I took out a drop of a cup of addition to the fund bucket. So it's, if you have saved and you've done well and you're intentional on your spending, I'm not burning the money, but you're probably doing well if you're listening to the money communities and planning ahead, but it's all about living your life. And it turns out I really love what I bought yesterday, and hopefully that works out good. But it was a money decision that's inconsequential to our asset worth, that I might have this item for 10 years or more.
Kevin, if you were to have this conversation again with somebody, like what would they've stumbled upon this podcast, or they heard you talk or eavesdropped a conversation that you had at a campfire, and they heard this term fund bucket and they said, that sounds good. I wonder if I qualify for a fund bucket. How would that conversation go with you to them? What are their qualifiers? What are there certain income amounts that you would either recommend it or not recommend it?
That's a wonderful question, because I've thought about this a lot in the terms of living your week. In retirement, you don't think about day to day. It's kind of just goes along fast. You might not have kids at home, so you don't see school seasons. It's just like, boom, 2-3 months are gone, 6 months is gone. In Arizona, it could be a whole year gone. It's always sunny outside. You can't tell the temperature unless you touch the window. And so I've really liked the Playing with Fire movies idea of write down the 10 things that make you the most happy. If you had 20 minutes and you could do anything you want, what makes your soul happy? And I think people don't do that. I don't think people live their happiest parts of their lives. And I think people wait till the weekend to do some of these things. On Saturdays, they do chores. Sunday, they do what they love. And then Sunday afternoon, they're thinking about work. Well, I tell people, why don't you do one of your 10 favorite things on Tuesday evening? Just cut out some time, set aside some time, go do something you love so that you're not just grinding through work. So basing it off of a life principle and not a fund bucket principle, what things do you love at your soul, in your core, and how can your resources that you've saved, put together, or are earning now provide for those soul nourishing enjoyments? And it doesn't have to do with dollar amounts. It doesn't have to do with life stages. If you like being outside or singing, do that. If you want to hike, maybe you go to a nicer hiking place or take the time for that, or buy better hiking gear or camping gear. So in our examples, I get a guitar, my wife gets a car, a classic car. Those are different levels after probably almost 40 years of driving 3-year-old cars, buying 3-year-old cars and driving them 10 years. It changes the scope, but it's different than just saying, okay, we started with 4% of our total investable assets or our total net worth 10 years ago, and inflation's gone up. So now it's increased some. That makes no sense to me. And that's too much math. If I know I have, in an example, $1,000 or $10,000 in a fund bucket to use in a month or a year, then I know I want to use that. If my fund bucket is $200 or $400 that I can use over the next few months, then I'll allocate that to something I love, rather than just walking through a store and just buying something that happens to be there.
So what I'm hearing is, to help shift with the mindset, just keep the process in place. Like, identify it as a process, and it is a process. It might be, one person's process to manage their fund bucket might be a little bit different than the next person's process to manage their fund bucket. But just as they went through processes to save, to gain that net worth, just look at it as another process on the journey. And if you do it like that, then it's just a step-by-step, whatever that sequence of steps is a person defines for themselves for the fund bucket. But that way, it's still a process. It's not this big ethereal, should I be spending money on this, or should I feel guilty for spending money on that? Or it's just another process on the journey. Is that a way to look at it as far as just that transition piece?
Yeah, I would say so. So that was what was beneficial for me was actually step one, identifying that I needed to spend more. Step two, funding the fund bucket and putting a name on it and saying that's what it's for. And step three is, well, how do you spend it? And so what I do is I use credit cards for points and all that stuff. And I reimburse myself from the fund bucket for those items that are kind of out of the ordinary. And like I was saying, many of those things I haven't even had to reimburse myself for because I wasn't short at the end of the month with my normal quote paycheck from my investment account that I pay myself just for general living expenses. But what I do is I keep a spreadsheet of all of these items that I've decided to spend on, whether I've already spent it or planned to spend it. So some of these trips we have coming up, I have trips planned all the way out for the next 18 months. And I know what they are going to cost because a lot of the things are, I have to pay for in advance or, I know exactly what that amount is going to be. And I put it in there as a line item in that fund bucket. And I know where I stand as to how much is left and where I'm going to reimburse myself. But let's say it's a $10,000 cruise and I find, well, I can refund myself or the $10,000, but if I only need 8 of it because it's going to fit within, I'll just give myself 8 and allow that fund bucket to, have excess in it. And then, at some point it's going to be empty and then I'll need to replenish it. And I've already thought about where is that going to come from and how am I going to replenish it? And what I've found is, so this was 2021, we're in 2024. So it's about 3 years into it, but I haven't spent at the speed or reimbursed myself from this at the speed that I initially thought I would. So I'm a little bit ahead. I'm still going to reimburse myself or, replenish that at the end of this year. I am selling a house again. So I'm going to use some of that to really, up the fund bucket quite a bit.
First off, congratulations. I know you got a lot of moving parts in your life right now. You're very busy. You started the podcast. Your daughter's still in the picture. I think you're staying, I'm not sure exactly and you don't have to share it here right now, but I know you got a lot going on and it's cool to watch from a distance and how when Kevin was talking, Kevin just came to visit me not too long ago and he was telling me about all of your adventures and how busy you're going to be. And I was just like, wow, he's out there doing it, living it. So good on you. And it's great to see proof of concept that this actually works.
I think part of that's living life, finding out in this chapter, this phase, this season, what is bringing you enjoyment. And Mark's finding community from the FI community, the Rock Retirement Club community, the Longmont community. He's uprooting his life to change some structure to bring in a community. And I did want to say to Mark, so just looking at this calendar year, the fund bucket freedom to spend, requirement to spend strategy is going backwards because the returns are good. And so it made me think about when you have an income and you get a raise, I could maybe consider this year's market returns if you were to cash in or at least sell and take the profits. That's like a raise. And the idea is save some of that and spend some of that. And so, David, that's what I was thinking about with your extra income. Save some, it's the whole Mark's whole make some, save and invest, live on the rest. Well, live and spend freely on the rest is where we're at. And if Mark and I had the same 2021 conversation about we need to take some icing off the cake, there's more icing now and there's less years to eat that cake. That's another part of the equation.
Yeah, I think that sounds good, and it's everybody's reality right now. But what would you say to somebody who's worried about starting a fund bucket and jeopardizing their retirement? Like, is there like a limit? Like, do not go beyond this? Just a general rule of thumb?
For me, if you can create a plan for yourself, obviously the first step is to make sure you're not going to run out of money for the essentials. And that's where, Kevin was talking about the retirement and IRA show, and they kind of come at retirement in a totally different way. Having secure lifetime income to cover your basis. And in that case, it might be for some people, Social Security or a pension or a portfolio of a certain size that will definitely cover all of your base needs. And then you start to think about how much excess is there. Of course, you're going to have contingencies and so forth built in as well on top of that. But even after all of those contingencies, how much excess is there? And that's literally your quote fund number, or could be your fund bucket. And then thinking about bringing that forward. So instead of spending that over a linear time frame for the rest of your life, thinking about how do I bring some of that spending forward into the time frame where I can truly enjoy it. And I think about it from like my mother's perspective. We're going on a trip to the Mediterranean on Friday. And my daughter's going, my mother's going, Stephen and Becky are going, Heptig, and another couple from the Rock Retirement Club are going. And I think about it from my mom's perspective. She has created this portfolio. She was, a saver as well. And she is now 80, I forget exactly, but in her 80s. And she's kind of regretted not spending some of these assets that she's accumulated over the years earlier. And here I am spending it earlier, bringing my daughter with me, creating those memory dividends. And I'm seeing how if you kind of delay this to a later point, maybe you're not going to be able to spend it all because you're not going to be in the best health. She's in great health, but somebody in their 80s may not be able to do this stuff. So really thinking about how do you pull it forward without jeopardizing your long-term plan. So that's really the key kind of balancing mechanism in this whole thought process.
Yeah, I think we assume that we're always going to be in good health. We do hear that's a common theme for people who are older, not your ages, but even older, like way older. You're both very young gentlemen. But it is something, those are the factors to consider because we kind of see life through the bubble that we're in right now. And then all those little factors that we think maybe matter more than they should, or maybe not identify some of those things that should matter, and we just don't see it. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Mark, you have a blog post about this topic, the fund bucket. You mentioned in that post, if you don't spend it, your inheritors gladly will. How has that influenced your spending habits with your fund bucket?
Well, it's funny, I talked to my daughter about that and I said, I hope you don't feel, put off by that comment. And she's like, no, we're doing this stuff together now. So in fact, we're flying first class not all the way across the ocean, but we have to make a stop in Newark, New Jersey to pick up my mom effectively. And we're flying. I called her and I was like, this is a long day. Should we just do first class? She's like, absolutely, let's do it. But she's not sitting there saying, Dad, you're spending my inheritance. She's saying, let's do this together. So, but however, if I was super frugal and not, flying first class for myself and it went to her, I think she's pretty well versed in all this. But let's say if it went to her and then went to the next generation, that secondary transfer of wealth is where you really see it. And I see it all the time where those people just spend like crazy. They didn't earn it. They didn't have to sacrifice for it. And they're just out there doing whatever. So it's usually not necessarily in that first generation transfer, but in that second generation transfer, man, those people just blow it. So I look at it and say, hey, you've accumulated it. You should spend it. Certainly, if you want to leave money to the next generation, that's great, but teach them well. But if you just hoard and pass away with this big pile, trust me, whoever you leave it to is certainly going to spend it without any qualms.
Yeah, so I think it's great that I think we all respect the accumulation and the saving and the investing, but the way you just said that, it's also like respect the spending as well and thinking multi-generationally. Yeah, I'm sure the statistics hold up to that. I mean, we hear stories, but I'm sure there are statistics that support what you just said. How when generational wealth is lost over time by the third generation. So yeah, I like the idea of respect the spending, and who better to respect the spending aspect of this than the person who built it, and that's how you're kind of looking at it right now. And your daughter, I have a 21-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. And so I thank you for bringing her perspective into this conversation, because I also think like that too. I mean, are my kids going to I've got it. Why not just give it to them? Then they maybe attach some kind of value of, do I care about them on a dollar amount? I don't think they're like that, but it is something I think about, and probably many people do think about that link. But in your case, your daughter's saying that she's actually looking at it as you're spending this money with her and it's a joint thing. So I think that's a very beautiful thing your daughter shared with you. Probably releases your stress at least a tad.
Yes, it does. And creating these memory dividends with her. So we did an Alaska trip. Last year it was actually a Rock Retirement Club trip that she went on with me. We're doing this Mediterranean one. Next year we're going to the FinTalk Scotland trip, and she's coming on that. So we're just creating these great, memories together. And she realizes, and I realize how valuable that is, because when I list my 10 things, family and community are at the top. So that is where I am devoting, this spending to, are those important things to me.
Kevin, what are the craziest, most outrageous things you think that you spent your fun bucket money on?
Before I get to that, I did want to make one comment is I push Mark and he pushes me, and we have some other friends that we push to use the fun bucket, to create a fun bucket. And so I do tell Mark, my wife and I don't have kids, so I do tell Mark, if you don't spend it, your future son-in-law will. And so he knows that Katie's excellent. And so they're living a good life. But because we don't have kids, I created a blog post that said, what we don't spend is going to go to the hogs. And the hogs are the heirs, the organizations, and the government, which are, nieces, nephews, charities, and taxes. So I don't really want to let the money go that way. I'm very safe, very cautious, very risk averse in normal life things. So I've structured that and have these buffers that are supposed to go out. Well, now it's only 40 something years, but it used to be 50 years from when I retired to get to the 90s. I don't think we've spent lavishly on things. Like, I still have a hard time going first class. Kathy and I went to Florida. Well, we met in Florida a couple of months ago after economy conference, and we were flying home together. And I booked her first class, and I booked premium extended economy right behind her, like 2 rows back. And it took me until 3 days before the flight to upgrade to first class because it was only $96 one way. I'm like, this is a deal. But when I booked her ticket, I made sure the seat next to her was free. So it's obnoxious to think I wouldn't spend $249 to upgrade to first class for a 4.5-hour flight, but $96 or whatever worked for me. I believe in the happy wife, happy life. Home works good. Kathy sacrificed spending for decades with me. Once we've been together 30 years or so. And now it's a good time to spend that. We have a beach home that we bought in 2012 at the bottom of the market. So we spend on that. It's not that expensive, but that's a use asset that will in the future be sold at some unknown dollar amount that will flow back into our retirement plan. Oh, that's one thing I should mention. Mark and I do have discussions about the difference of a retirement plan versus a financial plan. A retirement planner versus a financial planner. Financial planners tend to accumulate assets, set it aside, invest it, let it grow, don't touch it. You have a defined date of a target date of when you want to retire. So you have 18 years or 12 years to save before retirement. Your retirement plan takes the assets you have around when you retire and leave your career and quit bringing in income, and has to figure out how that money is going to get you through an end of plan, an end of life with an unknown date and, of course, unknown circumstances. And if you are in a couple, unknown timings for each of you. If you're in a couple, or if you decide you hate the other person when you're retired, we see that from different life strategies, people passing. And the other one I talk about is, what if you want to live this great life and you have a spouse that doesn't want to leave the couch? And so you have this sluggish spouse and you're on different paths and different spending needs. And there's so many variables in the retirement planning piece that it's very, very different from financial planning. So I think that's a key thing. And this fund bucket is part of all life stages of how to enjoy the assets that you've set aside or that you have coming in intentionally.
Would you recommend someone do this fund bucket before they hit their number?
Yes. Yes. I believe if you are saving $300 a month, maybe you set aside $50 for that month to do something you love. The goal is, I think, to be intentional of that money use. That's where this community is amazing. You have people of all ages, all backgrounds, and they're all thinking through the use of their hard-earned assets. And that's the key. I have read Part of Your Money or Your Life, and the overall concept of you're giving away time to get resources. What are you going to do with those resources? It makes perfect sense. That's from my observation. So yeah, it starts on Tuesday. Today's Tuesday.
What are your plans for your fund bucket going forward, Kevin?
Well, it's funny because we talk about the fund bucket, but I've never actually created an account at my brokerage until 3 months ago. 3 months ago, I created an account in my brokerage, and you can custom name it. And ours says F It Bucket right there on the brokerage account. So if they were to look at it, that's what they would see. And like Mark, we had sold a property a few years ago, and I had that in a couple different treasuries, and I moved those into that fund bucket account. And so it actually has the dollars sitting in it, and the treasuries will mature the 31st of this month and then next August next year. And that's enough to fund the large fund bucket through the roaring 20s, this whole decade. That's not our entire fund bucket. That's just a portion that I've carved off, probably 25% of the set aside that I have, or the 25% of the amount not assigned to base Great Life, aging assistance, buffer, that stuff. So even funded, it's a low amount. And in the retirement planner, there's a saying: you have your go-go years, your slow-go years, your no-go years. And that's generally 65 to 75, 75 to 85, 85 and up are the three phases. Well, because I'm under 65, Kathy and I, we call this our mojo years. And so Jim and Chris from the Retirement IRA show talk about targeting your fund number, your fund bucket, to be 65% in your go-go years, maybe 25% in your slow-go, when you can still go to plays, but you're not going to travel around the world. And then still keep 10% in your no-go for conveniences like eating out, maybe having someone take you to a play or the movies. So you can still take the fund bucket and allocate it in those phases. And I give this a lot of thought all the time. I talk to all kinds of people about this because if you don't think about it, you're not going to do anything about it.
And I would add to that, for me at least, having the fund bucket in liquid assets. So for me, it's in an online savings account. Kevin mentioned treasuries, short-term treasuries, but not investing it in equities, for example, and saying, oh, well, the market's down, so I can't spend this fund money. So for me, it's literally cash ready to spend. And that is really important. And then the other thing is, talking about the ability to spend from that. I'm going to be in Bali again this year at the 5 Freedom Retreat that Amy's doing. And we were on a cruise, Stephen and Becky and I, this past spring. And they were like, well, what other places do you want to go? And I said, well, New Zealand is on my list. And they were like, well, let's do it this year. And I was like, well, I was actually thinking more like 2026. And they was like, well, and Stephen was like, I really want to do it now. I want to kind of move that forward for me. And I was like, okay, we'll see what you come up with. And they came up with a 16-day cruise in New Zealand in December, I think it was. And I was like, well, I'm going to be in Bali until the end of November. What am I going to do in between? And they said, well, you had also mentioned Australia as being on your bucket list. There's another cruise right on the front end of that on the same ship for another 16 days. And we could just do that. And then you could come right from Bali, do Australia, do New Zealand. And then we mentioned it to our group, the Slackers, which Kevin is in. And Kevin was like, I'm in. And I was like, well, don't you want to ask Kathy? And he's like, oh, I'm sure she'll be good for it.
I said within 30 seconds, I'm in. I would figure out how to make it work. The ability to do that, to do something intentional, and it's with, it's going to be how many? 7 of us? 7 of us?
Because another couple jumped on too. Yeah.
Mark, if you can even look ahead past your, crazy next 6 to 8 year mark, what are some big things that you're going to use your fund bucket, or that you've got this idea, in a few years that you want to explore with your fund bucket funds?
Well, for me, it really is just continuous travel with friends or doing things with friends. So when somebody, and they tend to be mostly in the FI community because everyone comes up with these great ideas. And Kristen Knapp is talking about doing some land travel adventures in Europe. And I had her on a podcast and we were talking about it, and she lit up when she was saying, I want to plan these events. And I was like, you should do it. And I was like, I'll go, no question. So I just see continual events like this, and a lot of it revolves around travel, but more importantly, it revolves around community. And I just see that continuing. For me, it's not things. In fact, I've been downsizing and purging. For me, it's all about experiences. So I have no idea what those experiences will be, but they will definitely be with friends and community.
Is there anything else before we close out this episode that you'd like to share, Kevin or Mark?
We shared a lot. And so I'm wondering, what do you think about Fund Bucket? Do you think you could start small? It's kind of like, how do you carve out money for a Fund Bucket is exactly the same as you carve muscles, right? You start with a small amount of weight, you put in the reps, you work your way up over time, you see results, hopefully. Can you commit to creating a separate account that has to be used by the end of this year? I mean, that gives you plenty of time.
I love how you're putting me on the spot here.
Yeah, I mean,
because you're doing that, I will say yes.
I mean, do I have to come help you create an account?
I think I can manage that part, but I will start another account and funnel money that way, and we'll see it. We'll think of it as an experiment and how I feel about doing it. Yeah.
Good. And I think that's one point I didn't mention is one thing Mark and I and our friends have talked about to start this is we took our retirement calculators and we subtracted $100,000 or whatever off the top, just took the brokerage account balances, because it gets crazy if there's all deferred accounts or even the Roth accounts, which are, everyone's hold those forever so someone else can spend those. But if you have a brokerage account, just go to your calculators and subtract 10,000 or 100,000 and then rerun your Monte Carlo and see what happens. If that money is not calculated in the retirement plan, it's in a bucket off to the side. Rerun your numbers and see what it comes out with the results. The Monte Carlo comes out. That's what we did. So we didn't just say pick a number. We subtracted it from the brokerage like it didn't exist. Like we took that icing off the cake, just removed it and then recalculated. And so this is all done with huge intent. So I did want to say that it was a different way to recalculate with the fund bucket already spent or assigned for required spending.
I mean, that's what I did. Once I moved it into that fund bucket, it's as if it doesn't exist as far as retirement planning goes. It's as if it was already spent. It's gone. Although it's not, it's sitting there ready to spend, but it has no factor on the overall retirement plan at all. And that is what gave me the confidence to fund it. And I will redo that when I refill it. And I've already run those numbers and I'm fine. So there's no problem in refilling it.
So 2 things I want to bring up based on that. The first thing, especially depending on what phase you're in, somebody's going to say, I'm withdrawing from a taxable account or a taxable brokerage. That's going to be a taxable event. You don't care about that?
Well, for me, it wasn't, because it was sitting in cash already. So I was just moving it from my taxable brokerage into another account.
Selling assets in retirement in general to fund spending needs, whether it's your base rate life, minimum dignity floor, fun, aging assistance for the month if you have health care, home care. Selling assets should not be done at the time you need them. They should probably be done ahead of time, set aside. I did make mistakes helping my mom with that, where I only had, 3 months of money set aside. And it wasn't so much the market downturns that made it hard to sell some of the equities. It was, how do you deal with the taxes of qualified distributions, which are ordinary income, or capital gains distributions, which are more preferred, versus if it's going to be left to a legacy from my mom to the next generation, what are the inheritees tax rates? It becomes a huge calculation. That's why I said I had a 1 year and a 2 year short-term treasuries and Marquette cash. So it's not selling. We filled the bucket, just like if you have a 3-bucket portfolio strategy of future, first 3 years of retirement, or the current 3 years, 3 years to 7 years, and then 7 plus, or whatever it is for people, 0 to 5, 5 to 10. Selling assets in retirement or anytime is a real pain, and it's going to get harder as you get older and as they grow and as you shrink the window of when they're needed. So that's a great question.
And one thing that I could think about, if somebody didn't have money in a cash equivalent or T-bills or bonds or whatever, and they maybe tax loss you guys are smarter than me on this, but maybe tax loss harvesting is a way to do it. What if their assets in a brokerage potentially lost value that year, and that's what they sell maybe to fund it? Would that be a decent approach?
Yeah, that's certainly an option. What I do also is I've turned off all the reinvestment of dividends and capital gains in all of my accounts in the distribution phase, so that money is always coming into the cash kind of accounts. And that helps offset a lot of my spending to begin with. And then I also have a very long cash runway. My cash runway is closer to almost 10 years. And that's just where I feel comfortable. And the portfolio is of a size that's not going to affect the overall return of the portfolio. And so for me, it's very easy to see that cash spigot coming, on every quarter, every month, with interest and dividends and so forth. And I would say that, as you get closer to retirement, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 years pre-retirement, you need to start thinking about, how am I going to fund my lifestyle? Like, I have not had any income during my retirement years at all, zero. So I'm living entirely off of this portfolio. So that's why I like the long cash runway. I have the income coming in from dividends and capital gains not being reinvested. So there's this, constant water spigot that's refilling these buckets over time. So that is a mind shift from the accumulation years that I think a lot of people aren't aware of until they get into this phase.
I think it's like you say, forget about money. Live the life you love in your soul with intention.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much for sharing your insights and your experiences and your thoughts about creating, managing, and living with the fun bucket. And thank you all for watching and listening.
Thank you for listening to this week's show. Please click follow on your favorite podcast player or subscribe on YouTube to ensure you don't miss any future episodes. Also, please leave a rating and review for the show. This helps improve the ranking and enables other like-minded people find the content in their podcast players. If you would like me to answer a question on the show, please send it to mark@marksmoneymind.com and put podcast question in the subject line. Let me know your first name, or let me know if you would like to remain anonymous, and also your state of residence if you choose. I would also appreciate it if you would recommend this show to friends and family that might benefit from this content. See you next week on the Mark's Money Mind Show. Until then, make some, save and invest, live on the rest. And now for the all-important disclaimer. This show is for education and entertainment purposes only and should not be considered investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult the appropriate advisor or advisors before implementing anything you hear on this show or any other show for that matter. While I fully intend for everything on this show to be true and accurate at the time of each recording, occasionally errors may occur. So please do your own due diligence on anything discussed.